Good evening. I'm Rachel Maddow, and tonight we begin with a story that demands your attention, a story that strips away the diplomatic language and the sanitized press releases to reveal the raw, unvarnished truth of what is happening right now in Ukraine. This is not a story about abstract geopolitical maneuvering or distant military operations that feel removed from our daily lives. This is a story about human beings, about workers heading home after a long shift underground, about mothers in the sacred act of bringing new life into the world, about elderly men and women caught in the crosshairs of a war they never asked for and cannot escape. This is a story about what happens when the machinery of modern warfare is deliberately, systematically, and unapologetically turned against civilians. On Sunday, in the Dnipropetrovsk region of eastern Ukraine, 12 miners were killed when a Russian drone struck the bus carrying them home after their shift. 12 men who had spent hours in the darkness beneath the earth, extracting the resources that keep Ukraine's battered economy and infrastructure barely functioning, were eliminated in an instant on a frozen road in the small town of Ternivka. DTEK, Ukraine's largest private energy company and the employer of these workers, confirmed the attack and initially reported that 15 miners had perished. That number was later revised downward to at least 12 dead, with 15 others wounded and fighting for their lives. But whether the number is 12 or 15, the fundamental reality remains unchanged. These were not soldiers. These were not military personnel. These were working men, civilian laborers, targeted and killed while doing nothing more threatening than riding a bus home to their families. And this attack did not happen in isolation. It was part of a coordinated wave of violence that swept across multiple regions of Ukraine over the course of a single weekend, leaving a trail of death and destruction that defies any rational military justification. In Zaporizhia, a Russian drone struck maternity hospital number 3 on Bocharova Street, a facility where women go to give birth, where new lives enter the world, where the future of Ukraine takes its first breaths. At the moment of impact, 2 women were actively in labor, in the middle of delivering their children, when explosions ripped through the building around them. 6 people were injured in that strike, and footage verified by BBC journalists showed the aftermath in horrifying detail. Patient rooms covered in shattered glass and debris, a children's ward with its windows blown out, fires burning on the first floor while firefighters struggled to evacuate patients, including newborns, from the devastation. Even Fedorov, the regional head of Zaporizhia, responded to the hospital attack with words that cut through every layer of diplomatic pretense. He called it proof of a war directed against life, not a war for territory, not a war for security, not a war for any of the justifications that Moscow has offered to the international community, a war against life itself. And Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha reinforced that assessment, stating that the hospital strike demonstrated beyond any doubt that Russian President Vladimir Putin is pursuing a war against civilians, a campaign of terror that runs directly contrary to any genuine peace efforts. But the violence did not stop there. In the central city of Dnipro, a man and a woman were killed by yet another drone strike, their names joining the ever-growing list of Ukrainian civilians who have paid the ultimate price for simply existing in their own country. In Nikopol, a 72-year-old man was injured. In Kherson, a 59-year-old woman was seriously wounded by shelling. In Kharkiv, 3 more people fell victim to Russian attacks. Each of these incidents represents a family shattered, a community wounded, a nation bleeding from 1,000 cuts inflicted by an adversary that has abandoned any pretense of following the laws of armed conflict. And here is where the story becomes even more infuriating, even more revealing of the fundamental nature of this conflict. Just days before these attacks, United States President Donald Trump announced that Vladimir Putin had agreed to halt strikes during the brutal cold snap gripping Ukraine, where temperatures were forecast to plunge below minus 20 degrees Celsius. The Kremlin, in its characteristic fashion of plausible deniability, indicated that any such pause would expire on Sunday. And what happened on Sunday? Miners slaughtered on a bus, a maternity hospital in flames, civilians killed and wounded across multiple regions. This is the value of Russian assurances. This is the weight of Kremlin commitments. This is the reality that Ukrainian negotiators must confront as they prepare for another round of peace talks, knowing that every promise from Moscow comes with an expiration date written in blood. The attacks on Sunday also occurred against the backdrop of Russia's systematic campaign to destroy Ukraine's power infrastructure, a campaign that has left millions of people without heating or electricity during one of the coldest winters in recent memory. Since January, Moscow has launched wave after wave of targeted strikes on power plants, transmission lines, and energy facilities, transforming the simple act of staying warm into a daily struggle for survival. And now, as temperatures threaten to drop to levels that can kill within hours of exposure, that infrastructure war has been joined by direct attacks on the workers who keep whatever remains of the system functioning. The strategic logic is clear, even if it is monstrous. By targeting energy workers, Russia is not just killing individuals. It is degrading Ukraine's capacity to maintain its power grid, to keep hospitals and schools and homes heated, to sustain the basic functions of civilized society. Every miner killed is a miner who cannot extract coal. Every power plant worker wounded is a technician who cannot repair damaged equipment. This is warfare aimed at the foundations of national survival, at the very possibility of Ukrainian life continuing through the winter. But even as these attacks unfolded, another dimension of the conflict was revealing itself, a technological paradox that speaks to the complex web of dependencies that defines modern warfare. Ukraine announced that it was working with Elon Musk's SpaceX to prevent Russia from exploiting the Starlink satellite system for its drone operations. Ukrainian forces rely heavily on Starlink for communications and battlefield coordination, but this week, Kyiv's military reported finding Starlink terminals installed on long-range drones used by Russian forces. The very technology that has helped Ukraine defend itself was being turned against it, weaponized by the invaders to guide their instruments of death. When we continue, the Starlink controversy deepens. The peace talks shift to Abu Dhabi and the impossible territorial demands that stand between Ukraine and any hope of ending this war. The story is far from over. The technology that was supposed to be Ukraine's lifeline has become a double-edged sword, and the implications of that transformation reach far beyond the battlefield. When Elon Musk's SpaceX first provided Starlink terminals to Ukraine in the early days of the Russian invasion, it was hailed as a game-changing intervention, a technological gift that would allow Ukrainian forces to maintain communications and coordinate defenses, even as traditional infrastructure crumbled under Russian bombardment. The system became essential to Ukraine's military operations, enabling everything from drone reconnaissance to real-time battlefield coordination to the basic logistical functions that keep an army moving and fighting. Without Starlink, military analysts widely agree, Ukraine's defense would have been significantly compromised, perhaps fatally so. But war has a way of corrupting even the most beneficial innovations, of twisting tools of liberation into instruments of destruction. This week, Ukrainian military officials revealed a discovery that sent shockwaves through the defense establishment and raised profound questions about technology, security, and the nature of modern conflict. They had found Starlink terminals installed on long-range drones used by Russian forces, the very same satellite system that Ukraine depends upon for its survival being exploited by the enemy to guide weapons toward Ukrainian targets. The implications are staggering. Every advantage that Starlink provides to Ukrainian defenders was potentially being mirrored for Russian attackers. Every communication channel, every positioning capability, every real-time data stream that makes modern warfare possible was theoretically available to both sides of the conflict. How did this happen? The question demands an answer, though the full picture remains murky. Starlink terminals are commercial products, theoretically available for purchase through various channels, and the black market for military useful technology has flourished since the war began. Russian forces, cut off from Western supply chains by international sanctions, have proven remarkably resourceful in acquiring the equipment they need through intermediaries, front companies, and the shadowy networks that exist specifically to circumvent such restrictions. Whether these terminals were stolen, purchased illegally, or obtained through some other means, their presence on Russian drones represented a security crisis that demanded immediate attention. Elon Musk, responding to the controversy, stated that steps to stop the unauthorized use of Starlink appeared to have worked. The technical details of those countermeasures remain classified, understandably so, but the implication is that SpaceX has implemented some form of geofencing or terminal verification that prevents Russian forces from accessing the network in ways that could be used against Ukraine. Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, who has been the primary liaison between Kyiv and SpaceX throughout the war, thanked Musk publicly for being a true friend of the Ukrainian people. It was a statement that carried both genuine gratitude crude and implicit acknowledgement of how dependent Ukraine has become on the goodwill and technical capabilities of a single private company and its mercurial billionaire owner. And this dependency raises uncomfortable questions that extend far beyond the immediate crisis. What does it mean for national security when a country's military communications rely on infrastructure controlled by a foreign private citizen? What happens if that citizen's priorities change? If business interests conflict with strategic necessities? If the political winds shift in ways that make continued support less appealing? These are not hypothetical concerns. Musk's relationship with the Ukrainian cause has been complicated from the beginning, marked by moments of extraordinary generosity alongside controversial statements and decisions that have frustrated Kiev's leadership. The Starlink saga is a reminder that in the 21st century, the line between public and private power, between national security and corporate strategy, has become dangerously blurred. But even as Ukraine grappled with the technological dimensions of its predicament, the diplomatic front was experiencing its own turbulence. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that a second round of three-way talks aimed at ending the conflict would begin on Wednesday rather than Sunday as originally planned. The delay was announced without explanation, leaving observers to speculate about what obstacles or complications had forced the postponement. The talks, scheduled to take place in Abu Dhabi, would bring together Russian, Ukrainian, and American officials in what represents one of the most significant diplomatic engagements since the war began nearly 4 years ago. The choice of Abu Dhabi as the venue is itself significant, reflecting the shifting landscape of international diplomacy and the emergence of Gulf states as neutral ground where adversaries can meet without the political complications that would attend talks in Western capitals or traditional European venues. The United Arab Emirates has carefully cultivated relationships with all parties to the conflict, maintaining economic ties with Russia while also engaging with Western powers and providing humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. It is a balancing act that has positioned Abu Dhabi as one of the few places on earth where Russian and Ukrainian officials can sit across a table from each other with some hope of productive dialogue. But what exactly is there to discuss? The fundamental sticking points that have prevented any meaningful progress toward peace remain as intractable as ever, and the gap between Russian demands and Ukrainian red lines shows no sign of narrowing. Moscow currently controls approximately 1/5 of Ukrainian territory, including most of the eastern Donbass region that has been the focal point of conflict since 2014. Russian forces occupy Crimea, which was annexed in violation of international law a decade ago, and have seized substantial portions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson oblasts through military conquest. The human cost of that occupation is incalculable, measured in displaced families, destroyed communities, and the systematic erasure of Ukrainian identity in areas under Russian control. Russia's position in the negotiations is, to put it bluntly, audacious. Moscow is demanding that Ukraine formally cede not only the territories that Russian forces currently occupy, but also areas of the Donbass that remain under Ukrainian control. In other words, Putin is asking Ukraine to surrender territory that his military has failed to conquer on the battlefield, to hand over cities and towns that Ukrainian forces have successfully defended, to reward Russian aggression with territorial concessions that go beyond even Russia's current military achievements. It is a demand that would require Ukraine to abandon its own citizens, to accept the permanent partition of its country, to validate the principle that borders can be redrawn through military force. Ukraine's counterdemands are equally significant, though they receive far less attention in international coverage. Kiev reportedly wants Russia to return control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest nuclear facility, which Russian forces have occupied since the early weeks of the invasion. The plant has been a source of constant international anxiety, its 6 reactors representing a potential catastrophe that would dwarf Chernobyl if damaged by fighting or deliberate sabotage. Ukrainian officials argue that the continued Russian occupation of the facility poses an unacceptable risk, not just to Ukraine, but to all of Europe, and that any peace agreement must address the nuclear dimension of the conflict. The negotiations have been mediated primarily by the United States, with the Trump administration taking an increasingly active role in pushing for a resolution. But American mediation comes with its own complications and contradictions. President Trump has made no secret of his desire to end the conflict quickly, and his approach has sometimes seemed more focused on achieving a deal than on ensuring that deal serves Ukrainian interests or upholds international principles. The pressure on Zelensky to make concessions is immense, coming not just from Moscow, but from Washington as well. And the Ukrainian president finds himself navigating between the demands of his allies and the expectations of his own people, who have sacrificed enormously and are unlikely to accept a peace that feels like capitulation. As the diplomatic maneuvering continues in distant capitals, the war on the ground shows no signs of abating. The attacks that killed those 12 miners, that struck the maternity hospital, that wounded elderly civilians in their homes, these are not the actions of a party genuinely seeking peace. They are the actions of a military apparatus that continues to wage war with maximum brutality, using every available weapon against every available target, regardless of civilian status or humanitarian law. When we return, the human toll comes into sharper focus, and we examine what this relentless campaign of violence reveals about Russian strategic thinking and the prospects for any meaningful end to this conflict. The winter deepens, the death toll rises, and the world watches with a mixture of horror and helplessness as Ukraine bleeds. The mathematics of this war are staggering, but numbers alone cannot capture the full measure of what Ukraine has endured. Nearly 4 years of full-scale invasion, tens of thousands of civilian casualties, millions displaced from their homes, scattered across Europe as refugees or huddled in temporary shelters within their own country, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure systematically dismantled, an entire generation of children growing up with the sound of air raid sirens as the soundtrack of their lives. And still, despite everything, despite the relentless bombardment and the grinding attrition and the mounting pressure from supposed allies to accept an unjust peace, Ukraine continues to resist. But resistance comes at a cost that compounds with each passing day, each passing week, each passing month of war. The 12 miners killed on that bus in Ternivka were not just statistics to be added to a casualty report. They were individuals with histories and hopes, with families who loved them and communities that depended on them. Somewhere in eastern Ukraine tonight, there are children who will never see their fathers again, wives who will sleep alone for the rest of their lives, mothers who will bury sons in frozen ground. The grief radiating outward from that single attack will touch hundreds of lives, shaping futures in ways that cannot be quantified or fully comprehended. And that is just one attack among thousands, one day among 1,400 days of war. The strike on the maternity hospital in Zaporizhia carries its own particular horror, a symbolic weight that transcends even the immediate casualties. Maternity hospitals are where societies invest in their own continuation, where the future literally emerges into the present. To attack such a facility is to attack the very concept of Ukrainian futurity, to send a message that no space is sacred, no moment is safe, no act of hope will be permitted to proceed unmolested. Those two women who were giving birth when the drone struck, who experienced the most profound moment of human creation amid the chaos of destruction, will carry that trauma with them forever. Their children entered a world that was trying to kill them before they drew their first breath. What kind of war produces such obscenities? What kind of military strategy deliberately targets the moments of greatest human vulnerability? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that this is precisely the kind of war Russia has chosen to wage. From the earliest days of the invasion, Russian forces have demonstrated a consistent pattern of attacks on civilian infrastructure and civilian populations. Hospitals, schools, apartment buildings, shopping centers, train stations, theaters, power plants, water treatment facilities. Nothing has been spared. Every category of protected site under international humanitarian law has been struck, often repeatedly, with a systematic thoroughness that cannot be explained as accident or error. This is a deliberate strategy designed to break Ukrainian morale, to make daily life unbearable, to convince the population that the cost of continued resistance exceeds the cost of surrender. And yet the strategy has failed, at least in its primary objective. Ukrainian morale, though strained, has not broken. The population, though exhausted, continues to support the war effort. President Zelensky, though battered by criticism and pressure from multiple directions, retains sufficient political capital to continue prosecuting the conflict. The very brutality that Russia hoped would cow Ukraine into submission has instead galvanized resistance, confirming for millions of Ukrainians that they are fighting not just for territory, but for survival as a people and a nation. Every maternity hospital bombed, every miner's bus destroyed, every elderly civilian killed in their home reinforces the conviction that accommodation with Moscow is impossible, that Russia is waging a war of extermination that will not be satisfied by territorial concessions or political compromises. This creates a paradox that haunts the peace negotiations. The more Russia attacks civilians, the more it undermines any prospect for the kind of negotiated settlement it claims to seek. How can Ukraine negotiate in good faith with a party that is simultaneously bombing maternity hospitals? How can Zelensky sell territorial concessions to a population that has witnessed such atrocities and understands that surrendering land means surrendering people to the perpetrators of those crimes? The violence is not incidental to the diplomatic process. It is actively destroying the political conditions that would make diplomacy possible. And what of the international community, the collection of nations and institutions that have pledged support for Ukraine while carefully limiting their own exposure? The response to nearly 4 years of documented war crimes has been a mixture of condemnation and hesitation, of sanctions and military aid carefully calibrated to help Ukraine survive without enabling it to win decisively. The weapons flow has been sufficient to prevent Ukrainian collapse, but insufficient to alter the fundamental dynamics of the conflict. The diplomatic support has been vocal, but often ineffective, producing resolutions and statements that Moscow ignores with impunity. And now, as the war grinds toward its 5th year, there are signs that the patience of Ukraine's supporters is wearing thin, that the pressure for a settlement is building regardless of whether any just settlement is actually achievable. The upcoming talks in Abu Dhabi will test whether diplomacy can succeed where battlefield stalemate has persisted. The American role in those negotiations will be decisive, and the signals from Washington have been deeply ambiguous. President Trump's claim that Putin had agreed to pause attacks during the cold snap proved worthless within hours, as the bodies in Ternivka and Zaporizhzhia demonstrated. The administration's push for a quick resolution raises fears in Kyiv that Ukrainian interests may be sacrificed on the altar of American political timelines. And the fundamental question of territory, of whether Ukraine will be forced to accept the permanent loss of land seized by force, remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable under current conditions. Moscow controls approximately 1/5 of Ukraine. It demands even more. It continues to kill civilians while talking about peace. It exploits every pause, every negotiation, every moment of international distraction to consolidate gains and prepare for future offensives. The pattern is clear to anyone willing to see it. Russia is not negotiating in good faith. It is using diplomacy as another weapon of war, buying time and sowing discord among Ukraine's allies while maintaining maximum military pressure on the battlefield. The Starlink controversy that emerged this week is a microcosm of the larger challenges Ukraine faces. Dependent on foreign technology, foreign weapons, foreign political support, Kyiv must constantly navigate the competing interests and shifting priorities of partners who have their own agendas and limitations. Elon Musk's cooperation in blocking Russian exploitation of Starlink is welcome, but also a reminder of how precarious Ukraine's position truly is. A different decision by a different billionaire on a different day could have catastrophic consequences. This is the reality of modern asymmetric warfare, where private actors wield power that rivals or exceeds that of nation-states, and where the fate of millions can turn on decisions made in corporate boardrooms rather than government ministries. As this weekend's attacks demonstrated with terrible clarity, the war continues regardless of diplomatic calendars or presidential pronouncements. The dead in Ternivka do not care whether talks are scheduled for Sunday or Wednesday. The wounded in Zaporizhia gain no comfort from statements of condemnation issued by foreign ministries thousands of miles away. The elderly man in Nikopol, the woman in Kherson, the victims in Dnipro and Kharkiv, they experience the war not as a geopolitical abstraction, but as an immediate physical reality of pain and fear and loss. Their suffering is the true measure of this conflict, the human ledger that no peace agreement can fully balance or redeem. And so Ukraine enters another week of war, another winter of discontent, another chapter in a tragedy that shows no sign of ending. The miners will be buried. The maternity hospital will be repaired if possible, or abandoned if not. The power grid will continue to deteriorate as temperatures plunge toward levels that kill. And somewhere in a conference room in Abu Dhabi or a command center in Moscow or an underground bunker in Kiev, decisions will be made that determine whether this war continues for months or years, whether the death toll doubles or triples, whether Ukraine survives as an independent nation or becomes a cautionary tale about the limits of international solidarity. What happens next depends on choices that have not yet been made by leaders whose calculations we can only guess at in circumstances that continue to evolve in unpredictable ways. But whatever happens, whatever compromises are reached or rejected, whatever battles are won or lost, we must not forget the fundamental nature of what we have witnessed. This is a war directed against life itself, as Ivan Fedorov said, a war that targets hospitals and buses and homes, a war that kills minors and mothers and elderly civilians with equal indifference, a war that reveals in its daily operations a contempt for human dignity that should shock the conscience of the world. I am Rachel Maddow. The story continues because the war continues, because the killing continues, and somewhere in Ukraine tonight, in a country fighting for its very existence, ordinary people are preparing for another day of survival, another night of sirens and shelters, another chapter in a story that demands our attention, our outrage, and our refusal to look away. Thank you.